RUTH NOACK with a presentation in the face of a crisis seeking nuance. So thank you so much for joining us. We need to change the presentation here.
My thanks to Juliana and Lorenzo. I admire your seriousness in calling to this forum. Attitudes are important. I think it is at worst a lie. At best an illusion, and most probably a pity, to claim to be producing for professional reasons only, rather than for our desire to connect to the people we respect. In today's framework, a talk about my own curatorial practice seems self-serving, a propaganda of sorts. So instead, I will attempt to come to grips with the condition of crisis as such. In the second part, I will engage with a work of art, for to give space for art to come alive is one of the most important tasks of a curator's work. This is from a series by Piotr Szyhalski, an artist who lives in Minneapolis in the United States. And it was a series about COVID and Trump. Yet, if a crisis is the point in which a development makes a turn, the talk of crisis suggests that whatever is going on at the moment will soon be resolved, which is often plain wrong. People don't want to admit that a state of exception might be becoming normality, so they normalize it by calling it a crisis. In the face of crisis, it is not enough to weather the storm. Much more needs to be done, to do with actively involving oneself in changing the situation, like we heard in the presentation before me. That would also imply changing ourselves. Yet how are we to change ourselves if we cannot learn? Admittedly, when our institutions or instruments break down or prove ineffective, their structure and function can become evident through their absence. This is Hannah Arendt speaking. And thus, a crisis might provide an opportunity to learn how to repair or even improve institutions and instruments. At the beginning of the pandemic, the air teemed with inspired ideas for social change. In hindsight, though, that change escaped us. The lesson had not been learned. The truth is that it is difficult to learn anything in a crisis because it threatens our sense of control, which threatens our sense of self. To accept lack of control and to be willing to open oneself even further to the questions that come with learning is no small feat. Interestingly enough, I have met many artists who provoke a crisis in their work for exactly this reason, to be challenged to the core and to evolve. It might be one of the skills specific to artistic practice to be in crisis and to remain unharmed. Of course, self-induced and involuntary exposure to crisis impact differently on our psyche and on our being. A serious crisis demands of people to act with singular purpose and immediacy, for instance, to fight for survival. Analyzing the underlying cause of crisis is not necessarily possible or even reasonable. Yet without this knowledge, the remedy might be worse than crisis itself, for instance, nationalism. When there is no time or space to search for knowledge and reflect upon it, complexity and nuance is lost. For example, descriptions become dichotomous. It is us versus the enemy, and so the war against the virus replaces necessary policies against healthcare inequities, which are, for instance, in the United States, the prime reason why so many Black and brown people, so many more Black and brown people died during COVID. Even intellectuals are forgiven for shortcuts that would otherwise be denounced when they cross the fine line between showing solidarity with the people and parroting brute nationalisms. Where nuance is lost, more violence is likely to follow. While we are caught up in a crisis, our capacity to imagine the path forward to a better future diminishes. I think that Lorenzo Fusi was asking for us to come up with better practices, yet even our capacity to represent the present is severely inhibited during a crisis. And the longer the horror goes on, the more it escapes our grasp. Obviously, though it needs to be said again and again, not everyone is affected by every crisis in the same way. Whose crisis am I talking about? Or to reframe, whose privilege? I would like to read you a text commissioned by the Andrzej Wróblewski Foundation, pardon my very bad pronunciation, about a small drawing by the artist, probably drawn around 1950. I hope that by reading this text I can demonstrate, rather than speak about, something that can be done in the face of a crisis, which is to be true to one's material, one's politics, and one's heart. Forgot to show. This is also by Szihalski in reaction to the to the war on Ukrainian ground. This part of the text is called Preface to an Impending Disaster, and it was written on March 20 in 2022. When I chose this drawing to write about, I did so for its ability to hold time and place, and thus be, if not factually, at least in effect, transhistorical. Time, however, in real life sense, is faster than I am. If you would picture time and me running laps together, you would see it passing me by over and over again. And each time as it is passing, it kicks me out of its path. I lose my balance and fall to the ground. As I'm sitting there trying to gather my wits, as well as the courage to get up, I cast a hesitant glance forward, and I see something once more vanishing into the future. Time is something I never have. I couldn't even call it an acquaintance. Was there ever time to write this text? There have been moments when I thought that the right time had come to start the painful process of pushing out words. The beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic was such a moment, simply because of the sense of doom starting to infuse the fabric of life that was somewhat similar to what I recognized in this drawing. The absence of humans, the suspension of ordinary activity, the alienation from what I used to perceive as normalcy were all the more alarming because something dreadful seemed imminent. Into this utter stillness, into the quiet of sunny afternoon, something was going to come crashing down with what I imagined to be devastating, disruptive force. The feeling in those early days of the pandemic was not unlike what one might experience in a horror film. The thing Sigmund Freud called das Unheimliche. At any moment now, the monster was going to rear its head. Yet we all know that we were not living through a horror film, that what was happening was real, and that the monster had long been let loose. One of the most difficult things to grasp was the shattering of a shared perception or rendition of what was happening. People were experiencing the pandemic in diverse ways, and the only way we seemed to be able to find common ground was by connecting to smaller factions of the populace, separated from each other by identifiers of privilege or disenfranchisement. In other words, there was no commonality. While some were experiencing the debilitating effects of lockdown isolation, a disproportionate number of people affected by racial and economic inequalities were losing their lives. As the days of anxiety became months, a year, then two, the idea of impending doom dissipated. We were all busy dealing with the pandemic in one way or another. We were all in it, despite the lack of togetherness. We were all knocked off our feet, trying to get up again and again, as time, and with it the chance for real social change, flew by. No longer evocative of the present moment, the drawing had lost its urgency, and with it the need to write about it. Before abandoning my text, I had put down the following. An airplane comes crashing into the frame from above, nose pointing downward, promising annihilation no more than a blink of an eye away. The magnitude of the impending disaster is heightened by the machine's perfect perpendicularity when it should be suspended in air, soaring the horizon, not dropping to earth like so much dead weight. The tilted framing of the composition adds drama, suggesting a viewer, a witness to the scene, herself thrown out of balance. A friend had pointed out the two machine guns mounted on what is probably a Messerschmitt airplane, the German Wehrmacht plane, and added that the propeller is shown rotating. It might not be crashing at all, but flying low in an attack, though. To be honest, that close to the ground, it would be crashing anyhow. Though Wróblewski, born in 1927, had experienced war, this is a post factum composition, not a document. At best, it is drawn from memory, but more likely it is a distilled comment, not unlike the hyperreal narrative one might encounter in a comic strip. Wróblewski himself states, if one uses art as a tool in political and social struggle, one's painting cannot boil down to the photographic descriptive rendering of nature, but rather should concentrate on depicting the most crucial, striking features of a phenomenon, event, or model. This little drawing is an abstraction, depicting a reality, compressing the features of a phenomenon, something that is difficult to express in words, in one image. When I was thinking about this at the beginning of the pandemic, almost 2 years ago, I claimed, although the world is still living with the consequences of World War II, its life world experience is, for the most part, relegated to the stuff we call history. And those lucky enough to be living on European soil have successfully, although wrongly, suppressed the fact that many people around the globe are still experiencing war and other life-threatening conditions on an everyday basis. Wróblewski's little drawing is speaking to us from a very distant past. How deeply mistaken I was in this conclusion. Putin and his supporters have proven me wrong. That I was able to moralize about the Western gaze on war, or rather its non-gaze, yet unable to imagine war taking place in my country's near vicinity, reeks of privilege. In and of itself, there is nothing wrong with being unable to imagine war. No one should be able to do so. Yet the lack of sustained empathy that we Westerners have shown refugees in the past and are in danger of showing them in the future, when it is quite clear that many are seeking refuge from the consequences of our own colonial crimes, is insupportable. Most probably, a crashing plane is anything but silent, even when suspended in midair. Most probably, it makes a hell of a lot of noise. Children are learning to know these new sounds when they should be learning how to trust themselves. Doom is not impending, this is doom in progress. Much is being destroyed right now beyond buildings and bodies, and much must have been destroyed before to make room for this new reality. Philosopher Katie Chukrov suggests that the voluntary decomposition of the socialist state by the Soviet leadership was such an act. The past has hitched a ride with its friend time, and it has come up from behind to bite us in the back. The past has cut through to the present. It is a value of a drawing like Wroblewski's to allow us to think this interconnection of past and present, of abstraction and concreteness, without the pornography of war photography, without depictions of heroism, without nationalism, an anti-war image, an absurd image. Thank you.